It rarely begins with a catastrophe. More often, it starts quietly. A glass of wine to take the edge off a stressful day. A quick scroll through the phone so you don't have to sit alone with your thoughts. A cigarette that feels like a familiar friend. At first, it seems harmless, almost ordinary. But slowly, something changes. The decision is no longer yours. The urge begins to decide for you. Carl Gustav Jung once said, "What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate." And decades later, physician Gabor Maté would echo a similar truth. The question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. Addiction does not appear out of nowhere. It is never random. It is a response, a coping mechanism, a desperate attempt to soothe wounds that were never allowed to heal. Think about childhood. From the very beginning, we are shaped. We are praised when we behave, punished when we step out of line. We are taught which feelings are acceptable, joy, achievement, laughter, and which are dangerous, anger, sadness, longing. Slowly, we learn to hide parts of ourselves. We wear masks to gain approval. Jung called this mask the persona. It is the face we show the world, the version of ourselves that earns love, safety, or belonging. But there is a cost, because what doesn't fit behind the mask doesn't disappear. It gets buried. Jung called this buried part the shadow, the rejected emotions, the silenced desires, the wounds we never dared to show. But here's the truth. The shadow does not die. It waits. It influences our choices, our relationships, our behaviors, often without us even realizing it. And this is where Maté's insight becomes crucial. Addiction is born in the gap between who we truly are and who we were forced to become. It is the voice of the shadow, disguised as craving. It is the pain of disconnection, numbed by temporary relief. Look closely and you'll see it everywhere. The child who was never really seen grows into the adult who works obsessively, chasing recognition that never feels enough. The woman who had to be strong all her life turns to food in secret, because it is the only place she can soften. The man who was never allowed tenderness drowns in alcohol, searching for the warmth he once needed. These people are not weak, they are not broken. They are trying to quiet the ache of disconnection. Addiction is not the disease itself, it is the symptom. It is a mirror. It shows us where the wound is, where something essential was lost. And yet, in our culture, we treat addiction as failure, as moral weakness, as a lack of willpower. But Jung would remind us, what we repress will always return. And Maté would insist, until we address the pain beneath the addiction, healing cannot begin. Maybe you know this feeling yourself, that restlessness that never leaves, that hollow place in your chest. You try to fill it with substances, with noise, with work, with distractions, and maybe for a while it works. But the silence always returns. This is the invisible prison, not built of walls, but of masks, of wounds ignored, of feelings buried alive. And the hardest truth is also the most hopeful, because this prison was not built consciously, it can be undone. The path does not begin with shame or punishment, it begins with recognition. With the courage to ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. Because every craving is a message, every compulsion is a signal. And if we dare to listen, we may discover that addiction is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a deeper journey. When you look into a mirror, you see your face, your body, the familiar outline of who you think you are. But what you do not see is everything you've pushed away. The parts you hide not only from others, but often from yourself. Carl Jung called this hidden reservoir the shadow. It is the container of everything you once were told was unacceptable. Your anger, your fears, your needs, your vulnerability. But it also holds forgotten strengths, sensitivity, creativity, tenderness that you never dared to show. Most of us imagine we can simply discard these unwanted pieces of ourselves, but they do not vanish. What we bury becomes what controls us. The shadow moves underground, influencing our thoughts and behaviors in subtle and sometimes destructive ways. This is where Gabor Maté's insight cuts deep. He says, addiction is the language of the shadow. The cravings, the compulsions, the behaviors we can't control, they are the shadow trying to speak. They are the wounds we never addressed, the emotions we never allowed ourselves to feel, disguised as need. Think of someone who lashes out in sudden rage. The outburst often has little to do with the present situation. It is the echo of a wound long ago, an unprocessed memory that lives on in the nervous system. Addiction functions in a similar way. The bottle, the pill, the screen, they become a way of escaping what has been locked away. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Addiction is fate disguised as choice. We believe we are choosing the drink, the cigarette, the endless scrollings, but in truth, it is the shadow pulling the strings. And here lies a paradox. The shadow is not just the enemy, it is also the key. Because within the darkness lies the part of us that must be integrated for us to feel whole. The shadow is both the wound and the doorway. This is why people who struggle with addiction often describe a double life. The public mask, the persona of control, success, or everything's fine. And the hidden life, secrecy, shame, rituals carried out in the dark. These two selves battle constantly, leaving the person exhausted. But the real battle is not between good and evil, strength and weakness. The real battle is between the self we show and the self we suppress. The shadow is demanding recognition. Our culture doesn't help. We condemn addicts, stigmatize them, punish them. But in doing so, we also project our own shadows onto them. We hate in others what we cannot bear to face in ourselves. The irony is that addiction, in one form or another, lives in all of us. Some addictions are visible and condemned. Others, like workaholism, constant achievement, or obsessive busyness, are rewarded. But the root is the same, an inner emptiness we are too afraid to sit with. Gabor Maté insists, addiction is not about the substance or the behavior, it is about the absence of connection, the absence of safety, the absence of the freedom to be fully ourselves. And this is why the shadow matters. Because what we refuse to face will keep us chained, but what we dare to look at can finally transform. Imagine if instead of running, you turned toward the shadow. Instead of suppressing your grief, your anger, your longing, you allowed them into the light. Painful, yes. Uncomfortable, yes. But in that moment, the shadow loses its grip. The mirror becomes clearer. You see not only the mask, but also what lies beneath. And in that clarity, addiction begins to loosen. In every life, there are moments that leave marks. Sometimes the wound is obvious: abuse, neglect, loss, violence. Other times it is subtle: a harsh word, a dismissive glance, the quiet absence of warmth when it was needed most. To a child, these moments are enormous, because children cannot rationalize pain. They cannot say, "My parents were stressed," or "It wasn't about me." To a child, pain is personal. It becomes identity. I am too much. I am not enough. My feelings are dangerous. Carl Jung once said, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as destiny." And Gabor Maté adds, "Addiction is not the primary problem. It is an attempt to solve a problem, the problem of unbearable pain." When a child learns that their true self is not acceptable, they split. One part becomes the mask, the persona that gains approval. The other part becomes the exile, the wound locked away, carried in silence. But that wound never disappears. It lingers as restlessness, as emptiness, as longing. It whispers, "Something is missing." And when the whisper becomes unbearable, we reach for relief. A drink, a pill, a distraction. Something to make the ache fade, if only for a moment. This is the paradox of addiction. The substance is not the problem, and it is not the solution. It is a bandage on a wound that was never allowed to heal. For a moment, the bandage soothes, but it cannot close the wound. Maté often asks, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Because behind every compulsive behavior is a story of needs unmet, a story of connection broken. Consider this: a child cries for comfort, but no one comes. They learn, my needs are dangerous. A child rages at injustice, but is punished. They learn, my anger is not allowed. A child longs to be seen, but is ignored. They learn, I am invisible. Years later, these lessons return, not as memories, but as cravings. The drink gives a moment of comfort. The drug silences the rage. The screen fills the emptiness. But when the effect fades, the wound reopens, and so the cycle begins again. Society often labels addicts as irresponsible, weak, even immoral. But Jung would insist, what we call weakness is often the psyche's attempt to survive. Addiction is not proof of failure, it is proof of pain. The tragedy is that the world rarely asks what lies underneath. Instead of compassion, addicts are met with shame. Instead of understanding, they are punished. And yet shame only deepens the wound. Punishment only strengthens the shadow. But here is the deeper truth. Addiction can also serve as a signal. It is the psyche's way of saying, there is something here you have not faced. The craving points to the wound. The compulsion points to the absence. And so healing does not begin with force, but with recognition. It begins when someone dares to say, this is not about the bottle, this is about the child who was never held. It begins when we stop asking addicts to be stronger and start asking, where does it hurt? Because what was broken was not willpower. What was broken was connection, to safety, to love, to the authentic self. Jung and Maté both point us to the same doorway. Jung, integration of the lost parts of the self. Maté, reconnection to the truth of who we are. Both agree that only when the wound is touched, not avoided, not numbed, not hidden, can healing begin. And maybe healing is not the absence of pain at all. Maybe it is the courage to hold the pain that was once unbearable, to give ourselves now what we were once denied, to reclaim the self that we had to abandon in order to survive. Inside every human being, there is a tension of opposites. We long for intimacy, yet we fear being vulnerable. We crave control, yet yearn to surrender. We want freedom, yet cling to routines that keep us safe. Carl Jung saw these contradictions not as flaws, but as the very structure of the psyche. He described them as polarities, masculine and feminine, strength and softness, light and dark. When these energies move together, we feel balanced. But when one side is repressed, the psyche tips into conflict. And here is where addiction enters. Gabor Maté observed this imbalance again and again in his patients. A man who has always been told to be strong drinks so that, for a moment, he can finally let his guard down. A woman forced her whole life to be nurturing and selfless finds relief in pills that numb her exhaustion. The substance becomes a counterfeit balance. It offers, briefly, what real life has forbidden. This is why addiction feels at first like a solution. It restores what was missing: courage, relaxation, tenderness, release. But it is not integration, it is substitution. And so the balance does not hold. The cycle begins again. Jung described two archetypal inner figures: the anima, the feminine energy in men, embodying intuition, emotion, creativity, and the animus, the masculine energy in women, embodying logic, structure, assertiveness. These principles live in all of us, regardless of gender. But when culture, family, or trauma force us to reject one side, we are cut in half. A man who represses his anima may fear softness, bury his emotions, and compensate with aggression or addiction. A woman who rejects her animus may struggle to assert herself, hiding her power until it erupts in destructive ways. Both live in imbalance, and both may turn to addiction as a way to unconsciously reclaim what they lost. Maté would say, the addict is searching for wholeness. The bottle, the drug, the screen, these are not the real objects of desire. The real longing is for balance, for connection, for the freedom to be complete. Think about your own life. Where do you feel split? Do you perform strength while secretly aching to be cared for? Do you appear composed while inside you long to collapse? Do you demand control while craving the relief of surrender? Every repression creates pressure, and pressure seeks release. Addiction becomes that release, but without resolution. It is like pressing a valve that lowers the steam, while the fire beneath continues to burn. The question is not simply how do I stop this behavior? The deeper question is, which part of me have I denied? Which energy in me has been silenced? Healing, in Jung's language, is individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating both sides. Healing, in Maté's language, is returning to the authentic self, the part of us that can hold all our contradictions without shame. And in truth, these are the same. To heal is not to perfect one half of ourselves while erasing the other. To heal is to bring both together, the strength and the tenderness, the discipline and the surrender, the clarity and the mystery. This is why addiction, as destructive as it is, can also point the way. Every craving, every compulsion reveals the missing piece. The substance says, you have neglected this part of yourself, you cannot keep running from it. The task is terrifying but simple: to welcome back what we once exiled, to hold our contradictions instead of splitting them, to find balance not in the bottle or the needle, but in the integration of our own divided self. Because freedom is not the absence of struggle. Freedom is the capacity to hold all that we are without needing to escape. Perhaps the greatest illusion we live with is the belief that we are a fixed identity, a name, a job, a collection of memories. We cling to this narrow sense of self as though it were the whole story. But Carl Jung saw it differently. What we call the I, the ego, is only a small island floating on a vast sea. Beneath the surface lies the self, the totality of who we are, both conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, wounded and whole. Addiction thrives in the gap between the small I and the greater self. When we become cut off from our depths, when our authentic self is buried under roles, masks, and old wounds, a hunger arises. A hunger not just for substances, but for wholeness, for connection, for the lost parts of ourselves. Gabor Maté puts it plainly, addiction is not the problem, disconnection is. Disconnection from our bodies, disconnection from our emotions, disconnection from others, and, most tragically, disconnection from the true self within us. That is why no drug, no drink, no fleeting high ever satisfies. Because what we truly seek is not outside, what we truly seek is to come home, to ourselves. But this homecoming is not easy. It means looking where we least want to look. It means facing the pain we've run from. It means sitting in silence without reaching for distraction. It means allowing the grief, the fear, the longing that we buried long ago to finally rise. This is the path Jung called individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, embracing our contradictions, and becoming whole. And it is the path Maté describes as the return to the authentic self. 2 languages, 1 truth. And here lies the paradox of addiction. While it destroys, it also points the way. Every craving is a message. Every relapse is a reminder. The wound itself is the doorway back to wholeness, if we dare to walk through it. Healing, then, is not about erasing the pain. It is not about fixing ourselves or becoming someone new. Healing is about remembering. Remembering the child we once were, the needs we once silenced, the voice we once hid. Healing is the act of saying, I see you. I will no longer abandon you. And this cannot happen in isolation. Addiction isolates. It thrives in secrecy and shame. But recovery, in its truest sense, is not just sobriety. It is connection. Connection to our inner self. Connection to others who can witness us without judgment. Connection to life itself. Maté often says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And Jung reminds us, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. Together, these insights form a single revelation. We are not lost. We were never broken. We were disconnected. And what has been disconnected can be reconnected. So imagine for a moment what life could be like without the constant running. Imagine no longer needing the drink, the pill, the distraction. Not because you forced yourself to stop, but because you no longer needed to escape. Imagine being able to sit with your pain, and instead of drowning in it, you feel it transform into wisdom, into strength, into compassion. That is what lies beyond addiction. Not a life without struggle, but a life lived in truth. A life where we no longer fear our shadows, because they have been welcomed home. A life where we are not divided, but whole. This is the return to the self. This is the freedom we all carry within us. And it begins the moment we dare to stop running and finally turn toward ourselves. If this journey spoke to you and you want to dive deeper into psychology and philosophy, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Don't miss the upcoming videos. Together we'll continue uncovering hidden truths that can change the way you see yourself and the world.